Let the stories wash over you tonight, carrying you through ancient realms where heroes walked and legends were born. Before we delve into the legendary exploits that made Theseus one of the greatest heroes Athens ever knew, we must journey back to the very beginning, to a night when gods and mortals intertwined their fates beneath the stars of ancient Trojan. This is where our story truly begins, in the quiet coastal city, nestled in the northeastern reaches of the Peloponnese, where destiny was being woven by forces both mortal and divine. King Aegeus of Athens walked the earth as a troubled man. The throne of Athens sat beneath him, solid and eternal, yet his reign felt hollow and incomplete. No son had been born to him, no heir to carry forward the line of Erechtheus, that ancient bloodline that stretched back to the earthborn kings of Athens itself. Twice he had married, first to Maida and then to Chalciope, and twice his hopes had been dashed against the rocks of barrenness. The palace halls echoed with his footsteps, but not with the laughter of children, and this absence gnawed at him like a persistent wound that would not heal. In his desperation, Aegeus made the long journey to Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo resided in her sacred temple, breathing the vapors that rose from the earth depths and speaking truths that mortals could rarely comprehend. The Pythia, seated upon her tripod in the inner sanctum, received the king's question about his childless state. Her answer came in words that seemed simple yet were wrapped in layers of meaning, like the coils of a snake. Do not loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until you have reached the height of Athens, lest you die of grief. Aegeus, like so many before him who had sought the oracle's wisdom, found himself more confused than enlightened. The cryptic prophecy rolled around in his mind as he made his journey back toward Athens, its meaning slipping away like water through his fingers every time he thought he had grasped it. And so, as fate would have it, he stopped in Trojan to seek the counsel of King Pythius, a man renowned throughout Greece for his wisdom and his ability to unravel the knots of prophecy and riddle. Now Pythius was no ordinary king. He was learned in the ways of the gods and the patterns of fate, and when Aegeus recounted the oracle's words to him, Pythius understood immediately what the prophecy meant. But rather than enlighten his guest, Pythius saw an opportunity, a chance to bind his own house to the royal line of Athens. That evening he plied Aegeus with wine, cup after cup of the strong, dark vintage, for which Trojan was famous. As the wine worked its magic, and Aegeus's senses grew pleasantly dulled, Pythius guided his guest to the chamber where his daughter Aethra slept. But there was more at work that night than the machinations of a clever king. The goddess Athena, she who loved Athens above all cities and watched over its fortunes with particular care, came to Aethra in a dream. In this vision, the gray-eyed goddess commanded the princess to rise from her bed and wade across the narrow channel to the small island of Sphaeria that lay just off Trojan's shore. There, Athena instructed, Aethra must pour libations to Sphyros, who had once been Pelops' faithful charioteer, and to Poseidon, the Earthshaker, lord of all the seas. Aethra, still in the twilight between sleep and waking, obeyed the divine command. She left the sleeping Aegis behind and made her way through the darkness to the shore, then waded through the cool waters to Sphaeria. There, beneath the wheeling stars, she performed the sacred rites as Athena had instructed. And there, as she poured the wine upon the rocks and spoke the ancient prayers, Poseidon himself came to her, the god of the seas, that powerful deity whose very movements could shake the earth and raise waves that swallowed ships, possessed her in the darkness of that sacred island. When dawn broke and Aethra returned to the palace, she carried within her womb a child with two fathers. One was Aegeus, the mortal king of Athens, whose seed had been planted in the normal course of human congress. The other was Poseidon, the mighty god whose divine essence had mingled with her own beneath the stars of Sphaeria. This dual paternity would mark the child who would be born 9 months hence, giving him both the legitimacy of a mortal kingship and the extraordinary powers that came from divine blood. Before Aegeus departed Trojan to return to his duties in Athens, he led Aethra to a massive boulder that sat in a field near the palace. With strength born of his own considerable power, and perhaps aided by the gods themselves, Aegeus lifted this enormous stone. Beneath it, he placed his sword and his sandals, those symbols of his kingship and authority. Then, as Aethra watched, he let the boulder settle back into place. When our son is born, Aegeus told her, speaking with the certainty that this child would indeed be male, raise him here in Troezen. Do not speak to him of his father or his heritage until he has grown to manhood. When he is strong enough to lift this stone and retrieve what lies beneath it, send him to me in Athens. These tokens will prove his identity, and I will recognize him as my son and heir. With those instructions given, Aegeus returned to Athens, leaving Aethra to carry their secret. And, in time, she gave birth to a son whom she named Theseus. The name itself spoke to the child's destiny, derived from the Greek word thesmos, meaning institution or that which is established. For this child would grow to become not just a hero, but a founder, a reformer, a king who would reshape Athens itself. Theseus grew up in the palace of his grandfather Theseus, raised as a prince of Troezen, but kept ignorant of his true parentage and his Athenian heritage. The boy showed remarkable promise from his earliest years. He was strong, yes, but strength alone does not make a hero. He was also clever and quick-witted, brave without being foolhardy, and possessed of that particular kind of charisma that made others naturally look to him for leadership. Theseus, that wise old king, ensured that his grandson received the finest education available. The boy learned warfare and wrestling, the arts of governance and diplomacy, philosophy and rhetoric. He studied the old stories, learning of the heroes who had come before him, of Perseus and Heracles, of Jason and the Argonauts. Some sources tell us that Theseus also spent time learning from Chiron, that wise centaur who had instructed so many of Greece's greatest heroes in his cave, upon Mount Pelion. Whether this is true or not, whether Theseus ever made that journey to learn, at the hooves of that legendary teacher, what matters is that the young prince absorbed knowledge like parched earth drinks in rain. He grew not just in body but in mind and spirit, preparing himself, though he did not yet know it, for the extraordinary destiny that awaited him. As Theseus approached manhood, Aethra watched her son carefully, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth of his heritage. She saw him grow tall and strong, saw the way other young men deferred to him, saw the light of intelligence and courage burning in his eyes. And finally, when Theseus had reached his 16th year, when his shoulders had broadened and his voice had deepened and he stood, as tall as any man in Troezen, Aethra knew the time had come. She led him to that field where the great boulder sat, that stone beneath which Aegeus had hidden his tokens so many years before. "Theseus," she said, and there must have been both pride and apprehension in her voice. "The time has come for you to learn the truth of who you are and where you come from. You are the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and your destiny lies not here in Trojan, but across the sea in that great city. But before you can claim your birthright, you must prove yourself worthy. Beneath this stone lie your father's sword and sandals. If you can lift the boulder and retrieve them, you may journey to Athens and present yourself to Aegeus as his son and heir." Theseus approached the boulder. Other young men had tried before him, sent by Theseus to test whether the time had come, and all had failed. The stone was simply too massive, too heavy, too firmly settled into the earth. But Theseus, with the blood of both Aegeus and Poseidon flowing through his veins, bent his back to the task. His muscles strained, and his face grew red with effort. But slowly, inch by inch, the boulder began to move. The watchers gasped as this young man accomplished what no other had been able to do. The stone tilted, then lifted, and there beneath it, exactly where Aegeus had placed them 16 years before, lay the sword and sandals. Theseus lifted these tokens from their hiding place, and as he held them in his hands, the full weight of his destiny settled upon his shoulders. He was no longer simply a prince of Trojan. He was the son of Athens' king, with all the responsibilities and dangers that such a position entailed. For Aegeus had not produced an heir in all the years since Theseus's conception, and there were others who had their eyes on the Athenian throne, particularly the 50 sons of Pallas, Aegeus's brother, who believed that one of them should inherit the kingship. Aethra, having revealed this truth to her son, now had advice to offer about his journey to Athens. "Take the sea route," she counseled. "It is shorter and safer. The road that runs along the coast and through the isthmus is plagued by bandits and monsters, by men who have made themselves into terrors that honest travelers fear more than any beast. The sea journey will bring you safely to your father's city." But Theseus, young and full of that particular kind of courage that sometimes looks like recklessness, shook his head. He had grown up hearing stories of Heracles, that greatest of all heroes, who had performed 12 impossible labors and slain countless monsters in his travels. Heracles was, in many tellings, a cousin to Theseus. For if Theseus was truly the son of Poseidon, and Heracles was the son of Zeus, then they shared divine blood through their grandfathers, the Titans who had ruled before the Olympians. More than that, Theseus had heard that Heracles himself had taken the dangerous land route when he had journeyed through the Peloponnese, confronting and defeating every threat he encountered. "I will not skulk to Athens by the safe route like some merchant counting his coins," Theseus declared. "I will take the road that runs through the isthmus, and I will clear it of every danger that plagues travelers. When I arrive in Athens, I will come not as some unknown youth claiming kinship, but as a hero in my own right, with deeds to my name that will prove I am worthy to be called the son of Aegeus." And so, with his father's sword belted at his waist, and his father's sandals upon his feet, with the determination of youth burning bright in his breast, Theseus set forth from Trojan on the road that would lead him not just to Athens, but to immortal glory. The 6 labors, road to destiny. The road from Troezen to Athens winds along the coast of the Saronic Gulf, passing through some of the most beautiful but dangerous territory in all of Greece. In those ancient times, before civilization had truly tamed the wild places, this stretch of road had become a corridor of terror, haunted by men who had given themselves over to violence and cruelty. They were not monsters in the mythological sense, not spawn of Typhon or servants of the gods, but something perhaps more frightening because they had once been human and had chosen to become predators upon their own kind. The ancient writers would later call these encounters the 6 labors of Theseus, drawing a deliberate parallel to the 12 labors of Heracles, but where Heracles had been driven to his tasks by the command of the oracle and the will of the gods, where he had performed his labors in penance for a crime committed in madness. Theseus chose his own path. Each monster he faced, each villain he destroyed, was a conscious decision to make the world a better place, to clear the road of his terrors so that honest travelers might pass safely. This difference speaks to the nature of the 2 heroes. Heracles was strength incarnate, power barely contained, a force of nature as much as a man. Theseus was something else, something more deliberate and, in some ways, more human. He was the hero as civilizer, as bringer of order and justice. The first of these encounters occurred at Epidaurus, that city sacred to Apollo and his son Asclepius, the god of healing. Ironic then that it should be here that Theseus met his first monster, for there was no healing in what this creature did. His name was Periphetes, though he was better known by his epithet Coronetes, which means the club bearer. He was, some said, a son of the god Hephaestus, and like his divine father, Periphetes walked with a pronounced limp. But whereas Hephaestus had overcome his disability through his skill at the forge, becoming the greatest craftsman among the gods, Periphetes had let his physical limitation twist him into something cruel and bitter. Periphetes carried a great bronze club, which he used ostensibly as a crutch to support his lame leg. But this club was also his weapon of choice, and he had become expert in its use. He would lurk near the road, affecting the appearance of a harmless cripple, and when travelers approached, he would suddenly spring upon them with terrifying speed and ferocity. That heavy bronze club would whistle through the air and crash down upon skulls, shattering bone and brain, and then Periphetes would rob the corpses of whatever valuables they carried. When Theseus came, walking down the road from Troezen, his sword hanging at his side, and his young face bright with determination, Periphetes must have seen him as just another victim. The young prince looked strong, yes, but he was alone and apparently unwary, and the bandit had killed dozens of travelers who had appeared more formidable. Periphetes stepped out onto the road, leaning heavily on his club and perhaps affecting some pretense of neediness, some story that would bring the young man close enough to strike. But Theseus was not so easily fooled. Perhaps it was the divine blood that ran in his veins. Perhaps it was simply the quick intelligence that had been cultivated by his education in Troezen. But something about Periphetes set warning bells ringing in the young hero's mind. He approached cautiously, his hand never straying far from his sword, his eyes taking in every detail of the supposed cripple before him. The fight, when it came, was brief and brutal. Periphetes attacked with all the speed and skill he had developed through years of murder. But Theseus was faster. Some accounts say that Theseus tricked parafetes into handing over the club, perhaps by expressing admiration for it and asking to examine this supposedly bronze implement more closely. Others say that he simply fought the bandit and wrested the weapon from his grip through superior strength and skill. Either way, the outcome was the same. Theseus took possession of that heavy bronze club, and with it, he struck down its former owner, beating Periphetes to death with his own weapon. From that day forward, Theseus carried that club with him, and it became one of his signature attributes, appearing in countless vast paintings and sculptures. It was a symbol of his first victory, proof that he had already begun to clear the road of his dangers. But more than that, it represented the principle that would govern all of Theseus's dealings with these bandits. He would destroy each of them using their own methods, turning their cruelty back upon them in a kind of a poetic justice. Continuing his journey, Theseus came to the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow strip of land that connects the Peloponnese to the mainland of Greece. Here, at this strategic location, where all travelers between southern and northern Greece must pass, Theseus encountered his second great challenge. This villain was named Cenis, and he was often called Pitiocamptes, which translates to the Pine Bender. The reason for this epithet became horrifyingly clear when one learned his method of murder. The isthmus was heavily forested in those days, particularly with tall, flexible pine trees. Cenis had developed a technique as ingenious as it was grotesque. He would accost travelers and force them, sometimes through violence and sometimes through deception, to help him bend down two of these tall pines until their tops nearly touched the ground. He would secure the trees with heavy stones or ropes, holding them in this strained position. Then, once the victim was standing between the two bent trees, Cenis would tie one of the traveler's arms to one tree and the other arm to the second tree. And then, with a cruel smile on his face, he would release the trees. The pines, freed from their constraints, would spring back to their natural, upright position with tremendous force, and the victim tied between them would be literally torn apart, ripped limb from limb by the opposing forces. The screams, one imagines, must have echoed across the isthmus, a terrible warning to other travelers that it did nothing to prevent more victims from falling into Cenis's trap. When Theseus arrived at this section of the road, Cenis approached him with his usual methods, perhaps pretending friendship or claiming to need help with some task. But Theseus, having already faced and defeated Periphetes, was wary and ready. The specifics of their confrontation vary in different tellings, but the outcome was always the same. Theseus turned Cenis's own technique against him. He forced the pine bender between two trees and secured him there, then released the bent pines and watched as the man who had torn apart so many travelers was himself torn apart by the very trees he had used to murder others. But there is a curious postscript to this particular labor, one that shows us another side of Theseus's character, a side that was not always heroic in the modern sense of the word. After killing Cenis, Theseus discovered that the bandit had a daughter, a young woman named Perigune, who had fled in terror into the surrounding forest. When she saw what had become of her father, Theseus pursued her, finding her hiding among the wild asparagus and rushes that grew thick in that region. Perigune had reason to fear. She had just watched a stranger kill her father with brutal efficiency, and she had no way of knowing whether this stranger would extend his justice to include her. But Theseus called out to her, promising that he would not harm her, that he saw no guilt in her for her father's crimes. Whether Perigoun believed him or simply had no choice but to emerge from hiding, she came out from among the rushes. What happened next is presented in the ancient sources without much commentary, as if it were perfectly natural and acceptable. But to modern sensibilities, it is deeply troubling. Theseus, having just killed this young woman's father, now lay with her. To use the euphemistic language of the ancient historians, whether Perigoun consented to this or whether she had any real choice in the matter, trapped as she was with her father's killer far from any help, is not discussed in the sources. What we do know is that from this union came a son named Melanippus, who would be Theseus's first male child. Later, Theseus arranged for Perigoun to marry Dioneus, a man from Oechalia, and their descendants, it was said, held the rushes and asparagus sacred, never cutting them or burning them in fires in memory of the plants that had hidden Perigoun from Theseus on that fateful day. Moving on from the isthmus, Theseus came to the region of Crommyon near Megara. Here, the danger that threatened travelers was not a human monster, but an actual beast, though its exact nature seems to have been subject to some debate even in ancient times. Most sources describe the Crommyonian sow as an enormous wild boar, a creature of tremendous size and ferocity that had been terrorizing the countryside for years. Farmers dared not work their fields for fear of the beast, and travelers who tried to pass through the region often fell victim to the creature's savage attacks. The sow was said to be the offspring of two monstrous parents: Typhon, that terrible dragon who had once challenged Zeus himself for control of the universe, and Echidna, the half-woman, half-serpent mother of monsters. This lineage, if true, would make the Crommyonian sow sibling to the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, and other legendary beasts that plagued the heroes of Greece. It had been raised, the stories tell us, by an old woman named Phaea who lived in the region and who perhaps had tried to keep the creature as some twisted pet before it grew too large and dangerous to control. However, not all sources agree on this account. Some claim that there was no monstrous sow at all, that Phaea and the Crommyonian sow were one and the same, that the creature was actually a murderous woman, perhaps a bandit like Sinis or Periphetes. It was called a sow because of her repulsive appearance and boorish manners. This uncertainty reflects the way myths evolved and changed over time, with different communities and different tellers emphasizing different aspects of the stories. Whether the threat was a literal monster boar or a metaphorical sow in the form of a human bandit, Theseus dealt with it in the same way he had dealt with all the previous dangers. He hunted down the creature, fought it, and killed it, making the region safe for travelers and farmers once again. The ancient sources don't provide much detail about this particular encounter, suggesting perhaps that it was seen as a straightforward hunt, rather than a complex battle requiring extensive description. But the fact that Theseus overcame this threat, whether beast or bandit, was added to the growing catalog of his heroic deeds. Continuing northward, Theseus approached the coastal cliffs near Megara, where the road ran along a narrow ledge high above the sea. Here he encountered a danger that was as much about cruelty as about theft. The villain's name was skyrun, and his method of operation was particularly insidious because it played upon the conventions of hospitality that were sacred in the ancient world. Skyron would position himself at this narrow section of the coastal road, and when travelers passed by, he would hail them with apparent friendliness. He would invite them to pause in their journey and, in a show of humility that must have seemed touching to his victims, ask them to wash his feet. This was not an unusual request in that time and place, where roads were dusty and the washing of feet was a common courtesy extended to guests and travelers. So, the victims, seeing no threat in this old man's request, would kneel down before him to perform this act of service. And this was exactly what Siren wanted. The moment his victim was bent over, vulnerable and off balance, Siren would kick them with tremendous force, sending them tumbling off the narrow cliff path and down into the sea far below. But the horror didn't end with the fall. Lurking in the waters at the base of the cliff was an enormous sea turtle trained by Siren to devour any bodies that fell into the waves. Or perhaps, in some versions, it was not a turtle but some other marine monster, a creature that had developed a taste for human flesh because of the regular supply of victims that Siren provided. When Theseus came walking along that narrow cliffside path, Siren must have thought he had found another easy victim. But Theseus, who by now had developed a keen sense for danger and deception, approached the situation with caution. Some accounts say that Theseus pretended to comply with Siren's request, kneeling as if to wash the old man's feet, but then grabbed Siren's ankles and, using them as leverage, flipped the murderer off the cliff to fall victim to his own sea turtle. Other versions say that Theseus simply fought Skyron and threw him off the cliff through superior strength. Either way, the principle remained the same. Theseus was destroying these villains using their own methods, providing a kind of poetic justice that the ancient audiences clearly appreciated. Moving inland from the coast, Theseus came to Eleusis, that ancient and sacred city that would later become famous as the home of the Eleusinian mysteries. Those secret religious rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, but in Theseus's time, Eleusis was ruled by a king named Cercion, and this king had made his city a place of terror rather than sacred mystery. Cercion was immensely strong, a wrestler of tremendous skill and power. He had made it his practice to challenge every traveler who passed through his realm to a wrestling match. On the surface, this might seem like relatively harmless sport, a chance for a proud king to test his skills against strangers. But there was nothing sporting about Cercion's matches. The king would challenge travelers and give them no choice but to accept. Then, once they were in his grip, he would use his superior skill and strength to defeat them. And every opponent that Cercion defeated, without exception, he killed. Perhaps Cercion promised that any man who could beat him would win his kingdom, a tempting prize that might have driven some travelers to accept his challenge willingly. But no one ever won. Cercion was simply too good, too strong, too experienced in the ways of wrestling. His victims piled up over the years, and the road through Eleusis became one more gauntlet of death that travelers had to run if they wanted to reach Athens from the south. But in Theseus, Cercion met his match. The young hero was not just strong, he was also skilled. and he had been trained in wrestling by the best teachers in Troezen. More than that, Theseus brought something new to the match, something that Cercyon had never encountered before. Where Cercyon relied on brute strength and the tried and true holds and throws that had never failed him, Theseus employed technique and intelligence. He used leverage and timing, found the weaknesses in Cercyon's style, and exploited them ruthlessly. The sources tell us that Theseus lifted Cercyon high into the air and then slammed him down onto the ground with such force that the king's back broke. It was a decisive, devastating victory, and it sent a clear message to any who might have heard the story. This young man traveling the road to Athens was not to be underestimated. After defeating Cercyon, Theseus could have claimed the kingship of Eleusis for himself, but he chose not to. His destination was Athens, and that was where his destiny lay. The sixth and final labor of Theseus's journey came in the vicinity of Eleusis, on the road that led toward Athens. Here, Theseus encountered a villain whose name has become synonymous with forcing people into rigid, inflexible standards. His name was Procrustes, which means the stretcher, though he was sometimes also called Damastes or Polypemon. He was said by some to be a son of Poseidon, which, if true, would make him a half-brother to Theseus, though neither hero nor villain seemed aware of this connection if it existed. Procrustes had set up a kind of inn or rest stop along the road, and he would invite weary travelers to spend the night at his establishment. This, again, played upon the sacred customs of hospitality that governed Greek society. A traveler who had been walking all day would be grateful for a place to rest, and Procrustes would seem like a gracious host, offering food and, most important, a bed in which to sleep. But Procrustes had two beds, one that was very long and one that was quite short, and he had developed a grotesque system for fitting his guests to these beds. If a traveler was tall and ended up in the short bed, Procrustes would use an axe to chop off the guest's feet and legs until the body fit the bed's dimensions. If a traveler was short and ended up in the long bed, Procrustes would stretch the victim on a rack until their body had been elongated to fit from headboard to footboard. Since Procrustes controlled which bed each guest was assigned to, and since the two beds were of such different sizes, no traveler ever fit properly. Every guest who stayed in Procrustes' inn was mutilated and killed. When Theseus arrived at this establishment, Procrustes greeted him with the same false hospitality he had shown to all his previous victims. But Theseus, who by now had become adept at spotting danger, quickly understood what was happening. Rather than fall victim to Procrustes' deadly hospitality, Theseus turned the tables on his host. He forced Procrustes onto one of the beds, and because Procrustes himself was quite tall, he had to be made to fit the shorter bed. With Procrustes' own axe, Theseus chopped off the villain's legs and then beheaded him, ensuring that the Inn of Horrors would claim no more victims. And with that sixth labor complete, Theseus had cleared the road from Troezen to Athens of its major dangers. He had defeated 6 different threats, each one using a different form of cruelty and murder to terrorize travelers. In each case, he had used the villain's own methods against them, providing a kind of symmetrical justice that the ancient Greeks particularly appreciated. But more than that, he had demonstrated the qualities that would make him a great hero and king. He was brave without being reckless, strong without relying only on strength, clever enough to outwit his enemies, and dedicated to the principle that might should be used in service of right. When Theseus finally walked through the gates of Athens, his sword at his side and Periphetes' club slung over his shoulder, he came not as some unknown youth claiming to be the king's son, but as a hero whose deeds had already begun to spread throughout Greece. The road from Troezen to Athens, which for so long had been a corridor of terror, was now safe for travelers. And it was Theseus who had made it so. This was the young man who now arrived at the court of King Aegeus, ready to claim his birthright and begin the next chapter of his remarkable story. Athens and the Marathon Bull. Theseus's arrival in Athens was not the joyous reunion of father and son that one might expect. The young hero, mindful of potential dangers and perhaps wanting to assess the situation before revealing his identity, did not immediately present himself as Aegeus' son. Instead, he entered the city as simply another young warrior, distinguished perhaps by the tales of his exploits on the road from Troezen, but not declaring his royal lineage. This caution proved to be wisdom, for the palace of Athens held dangers that no club or sword could easily defeat. King Aegeus had remarried in the years since he had lain with Aethra in Troezen. His new wife was Medea, a name that should make anyone familiar with Greek mythology shudder with apprehension. This was the same Medea who had helped Jason steal the golden fleece from her father Aeetes, the same Medea who had murdered her own brother Absyrtus to help Jason escape, the same Medea who had tricked the daughters of Peleus into killing their own father, when Jason had later betrayed her by planning to marry another woman. Medea had taken terrible revenge, killing Jason's new bride, and, most horrifically, murdering her own children by Jason to punish their faithless father. How Medea had come to Athens and married Aegeus is a story in itself. After fleeing Corinth in a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather Helios the sun god, Medea had wandered until she came to Athens. She had promised Aegeus, who still desperately wanted an heir, that through her magical arts she could give him children. Aegeus, not knowing the full extent of Medea's crimes, or perhaps not caring, had married her. She had borne him a son named Medus, and now both mother and child had a vested interest in ensuring that no other heir appeared to challenge Medus's claim to the Athenian throne. Medea, being a powerful sorceress with the gifts of prophecy and divine insight, recognized Theseus for who he truly was the moment he entered the palace. She saw the sword at his side, the sandals on his feet, saw the way he carried himself, and knew immediately that this was Aegeus's long-lost son from Troezen. And she knew that if Aegeus acknowledged Theseus as his heir, her own son, Medus, would lose any claim to the throne. So Medea began to plot. She went to Aegeus and whispered poison in his ear, telling him that this strong young stranger who had come to Athens was dangerous, that he had designs on the throne, that he was a threat to Aegeus's rule. Remember, Aegeus did not know that Theseus was his son. All the king saw was a powerful young warrior, whose growing fame might make him a rival for power. And Aegeus was in a precarious position. His brother Pallas had 50 sons, the Palantidae, and they were all waiting for Aegeus to die, so that one of them could claim the throne. Any strong young man who entered Athens and began to attract followers could be a potential usurper. Medea's plan was simple and direct. She would poison Theseus. She prepared a cup of wine laced with aconite, a deadly toxin also known as wolfsbane, and convinced Aegeus that this stranger should be welcomed to a feast in the palace. There, she planned, the young hero would drink the poison wine and die, eliminating the threat to her son's inheritance. The feast was prepared, and Theseus was indeed invited to dine at the king's table. He came, still not revealing his identity, and sat among the other guests. Medea, playing the role of gracious hostess, offered Theseus the cup of wine that she had poisoned. But fate, or perhaps the gods who had taken an interest in Theseus's story, intervened. As Theseus reached out to take the cup, preparing to drink, Aegeus's eyes fell upon the sword that the young man wore at his side. The king leaned forward, looking more closely, and recognition dawned in his eyes. It was his sword, the one he had left under the boulder in Trozen all those years ago, which meant that this young man, this hero who had cleared the road of its bandits and monsters, was his son, the heir he had longed for through so many childless years. In that moment, Aegeus acted with the speed of desperation. He leapt from his seat and struck the cup from Theseus's hand, sending the poisoned wine splashing across the floor. Where the liquid touched the stone, it was said, the marble hissed and bubbled. So potent was the poison Medea had prepared. Theseus, understanding immediately what had nearly happened, drew his sword and would have killed Medea on the spot. But she was too quick. Using her sorcery, she wrapped herself and her son, Metis, in a cloud of darkness, and escaped from Athens, fleeing back toward her homeland of Colchis. Athens was rid of her, and father and son were finally truly united. But the joyous reunion was short-lived, for the city faced a crisis that would test both Aegeus and his newly acknowledged heir. And it wasn't long before Theseus faced his first real challenge as a prince of Athens, one that would let him prove his worth, not just as a warrior, but as a hero who would defend his father's city. The problem involved a bull, but not just any bull. This was the famous marathon bull, a creature of tremendous size and ferocity that was rampaging through the countryside around the town of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The bull had a legendary pedigree. Years before, it had been captured by the hero Heracles as part of his seventh labor. Heracles had subdued the beast in Crete, where it had been terrorizing the kingdom of Minos, and had brought it back to Greece to present to King Eurystheus. But Eurystheus, who had a history of poor decisions regarding the dangerous creatures that Heracles brought him, had simply released the bull, allowing it to roam free. The bull had eventually made its way to Marathon, where it began to cause havoc. It trampled fields, destroyed crops, gored farmers and travelers, and generally made the region uninhabitable. Several young men had tried to hunt the beast and failed, losing their lives in the attempt. The people of Marathon had sent desperate pleas to Athens for help, and Aegeus knew that something had to be done. But there was also political calculation involved in this situation. The 50 sons of Pallas, the Palantidae, were growing more vocal in their opposition to Aegeus, and their claim that one of them should rule Athens instead. They pointed out that Aegeus was old, that he had no legitimate heir, that the city needed strong leadership. The sudden appearance of Theseus as Aegeus's acknowledged son and heir had thrown their plans into disarray. but they were not ready to give up their ambitions. Some of them had even begun to plot open rebellion. Medea, before her expulsion, had suggested that Theseus be sent to deal with the marathon bull, hoping that the beast would kill him and remove the obstacle to her son's inheritance. Now, with Medea gone, but the bull still rampaging, Aegeus reluctantly agreed that his newly found son should face this challenge. It was a way for Theseus to prove himself to the people of Athens, to show that he was truly worthy to be their prince and future king. But it was also dangerous, and Aegeus must have sent his son off with considerable trepidation. Theseus, however, was confident. He had faced and defeated 6 different threats on his journey from Trozen. He had the strength that came from his dual parentage, the skill that came from his training, and the experience he had gained in actual combat against enemies both human and monstrous. A bull, however fierce, was just another challenge to overcome. The young hero traveled to Marathon and tracked the bull to its lair. The fight that followed was fierce and brutal. The bull was not just large, but also seemed to possess almost supernatural fury and strength. Perhaps a remnant of whatever divine curse or influence had made it such a terror in Crete. It charged at Theseus with its massive horns lowered, trying to gore him, its hooves churning up the earth as it thundered toward him again and again. But Theseus was faster and smarter than the beast. He dodged its charges, exhausting it, learning its patterns and habits. And finally, when the moment was right, he leaped upon the bull's back, wrapped his strong arms around its neck, and wrestled it to the ground. Some versions of the story say he strangled it or broke its neck. Others say he simply subdued it and tied it securely, then led it back to Athens like a farmer bringing an ox to market. Once in Athens, Theseus sacrificed the marathon bull to Apollo, the god of prophecy and civilization, as a thanks offering for his victory. The sacrifice was performed with great ceremony, and the people of Athens who had gathered to watch were impressed by this demonstration of strength and piety. Here was a young man who was not just a warrior, but also someone who understood the importance of honoring the gods and providing for the safety of the people. This successful capture and sacrifice of the marathon bull accomplished several important things for Theseus. First, it proved to the people of Athens that Aegeus's newly acknowledged heir was indeed a hero worthy of the title. Second, it consolidated Theseus's position in the city, making it much more difficult for the Palantidae to argue that he was unworthy to inherit the throne. And third, it brought Theseus to the attention of the entire city, making him a public figure whose deeds were beginning to match those of the greatest heroes of the age. The Palantidae, seeing their opportunity to claim the throne slipping away, decided to act. They divided their forces into 2 groups and launched a coordinated attack on Athens, planning to overwhelm Aegeus's defenses and seize power by force. But their plan was betrayed by a herald named Laos, who warned Theseus of the coming assault. The young hero, demonstrating the tactical intelligence that would later make him a successful military commander, led Athens' defenders in a counterattack that routed the Palantidae. Many of the 50 sons of Pallas were killed in the fighting, and the survivors were forced to flee or surrender. With this victory, Theseus had secured not just his own position as heir, but also his father's throne. The greatest threat to Aegeus's rule had been eliminated, and the king could rule without fear, that his brother's sons would overthrow him. For Theseus, it was another triumph to add to his growing legend. He had defeated bandits, monsters, and now a concerted military assault by his own cousins. Athens was safe, Aegeus's reign was secure, and Theseus was hailed as the savior of the city. But the young hero's greatest trial still lay ahead, for Athens was not truly free, not truly safe, not truly prosperous. The city labored under a terrible obligation, a tribute paid in blood to the kingdom of Crete and its powerful King Minos. And it would be in confronting this obligation, in descending into the darkness of the labyrinth to face the Minotaur, that Theseus would perform the deed for which he is most remembered. But that story, famous though it is one we already know well. For now, let us move forward past the labyrinth, past the black sails and the death of Aegeus, past Theseus's triumph over the Minotaur and his tragic abandonment of Ariadne, to explore the many other adventures that filled Theseus's remarkable life. The Amazon conquest. After his return from Crete and his coronation as king of Athens following his father's tragic death, Theseus did not rest on his laurels. The young king was ambitious, driven by a restless energy that would not let him remain idle in his palace, while there were still adventures to be had, glory to be won, and threats to be conquered. Among the many exploits of his kingship, few would prove as consequential or as controversial as his encounter with the Amazons, those legendary warrior women who lived at the very edges of the known world. The Amazons were no myth or exaggeration. They were a nation of women living somewhere near the shores of the Black Sea in what is now the region of the Caucasus. Their very existence challenged the Greek understanding of proper gender roles and society. These were women who did not marry in the traditional sense, who did not confine themselves to the home and the spinning of wool. They were warriors, riders, archers, hunters. Some said they removed their right breast to better draw a bow, though this claim is disputed and may have been Greek propaganda meant to make the Amazons seem more alien and unnatural. The Amazons descended, the stories tell us, from Ares, the god of war, and the nymph Harmonia. They had their own kingdom, their own queens, their own laws and customs. Once a year, they would meet with men from neighboring tribes solely for the purpose of procreation. Male children born from these unions were either killed, sent to their fathers, or raised as servants, depending on which version of the story one believes. Female children were kept and trained from birth in the arts of war, taught to ride before they could walk properly, taught to shoot before they could read. There were many famous Amazon queens whose names echoed through the legends of Greece. Penthesilea, who would later fate in the Trojan War and be killed by Achilles. Hippolyta, who possessed a magical girdle given to her by her father Ares, a belt that Heracles would be sent to steal as one of his 12 labors. Melanippe, known for her speed and skill with the bow, and Antiope, whose fate would become tragically entwined with that of Theseus. The exact circumstances of Theseus's first encounter with the Amazons are disputed among the ancient sources, with different authors providing different accounts that sometimes contradict each other in fundamental ways. But we can piece together the basic outline of what happened, even if some of the specific details remain murky. In one version of the story, Theseus accompanied his friend and cousin Heracles on that hero's 9th labor, which was to steal the girdle of Hippolyta, the Amazon queen. Heracles had been commanded by King Eurystheus to bring back this magical belt, and he assembled a crew of heroes to help him make the dangerous journey to the land of the Amazons. Theseus, always eager for adventure and glory, joined this expedition. When the Greeks arrived at Themyscira, the capital city of the Amazons, they were initially received with something close to hospitality. Hippolyta herself came to their ship and was impressed by Heracles' fame and reputation. Some sources say she even fell in love with the Greek hero. She agreed to give him her girdle willingly, without any need for violence or theft. But then the goddess Hera, who hated Heracles with an immortal's capacity for endless grudges, intervened. She disguised herself as an Amazon and spread a rumor among the warrior women that these Greek men were planning to kidnap their queen and carry her away. The Amazons, fierce and protective of their own, immediately armed themselves and attacked the Greek ship. In the chaos of the ensuing battle, Heracles, believing that Hippolyta had betrayed him and ordered the attack, killed the queen and took her girdle from her corpse. But during the fighting, Theseus managed to capture one of the other Amazon leaders. Depending on which ancient source you consult, this captive was either Antiope, Hippolyta's sister, or Melanippe, another Amazon warrior, or even Hippolyta herself before Heracles killed her. The confusion in the sources might reflect different local traditions, or might simply be the result of various storytellers changing details to suit their particular narratives. Another version of the tale dispenses with Heracles entirely and makes Theseus the primary hero of the story. In this telling, Theseus led his own expedition to the land of the Amazons, seeking to prove himself against these legendary warriors. When he arrived, the Amazon queen, whether Hippolyta or Antiope depending on the source, came to his ship. Perhaps she was curious about these Greek visitors. Perhaps she was initially friendly, not seeing them as a threat. But Theseus, through some combination of force and charm, abducted her and set sail for Athens before the other Amazons could organize a response. Yet another tradition claims that the Amazon queen actually fell in love with Theseus and willingly accompanied him back to Athens, betraying her own people for the sake of this Greek king whom she had just met. This version makes the story somewhat less problematic from a modern perspective, transforming it from an abduction into a kind of romantic elopement. But even this supposedly more positive interpretation raises troubling questions about why an Amazon queen raised in a society of warrior women who had no need for men beyond procreation would suddenly abandon everything she knew to run away with a foreign stranger, regardless of exactly how Theseus came to possess an Amazon bride, whether through capture or seduction, through force or love. The result was the same. He brought her back to Athens and made her his wife. She gave him a son, a boy whom they named Hippolytus, after the queen whom Heracles had killed. This son would grow up to be a devotee of Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, and his tragic fate would later bring enormous sorrow to Theseus. But that is a story for later in our tale. The Amazons, meanwhile, were not content to let this insult stand. Whether their queen had been kidnapped by force or had left willingly with Theseus, the result was the same from their perspective. Their leader had been taken from them by a Greek king, and this could not be tolerated. To allow such an act to go unpunished would make them appear weak, would encourage other Greek heroes to raid their territory and steal their warriors. So the Amazons gathered their forces and launched an invasion of Athens itself. This was no small raiding party or minor skirmish. The Amazons came with a full army, thousands of warrior women mounted on horses, armed with their distinctive double-headed axes and their powerful bows, determined to retrieve their queen or avenge her capture. They crossed the Black Sea, marched through Thrace, and down through Thessaly, passed through the Vale of Tempe, and finally arrived in Attica, the region controlled by Athens. The invasion caught Athens unprepared. Theseus had not expected the Amazons to come so far, or to bring such a large force. The warrior women were able to march right up to the city itself and establish a camp on the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, right in the heart of Athens. From this position, they began to lay siege to the city, cutting off supply lines and launching raids against Athenian forces. For 4 months, the Amazons held their position, and Athens was in mortal danger. Theseus, the brilliant young hero who had overcome so many challenges, found himself facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. These were not bandits like those he had defeated on the road from Troezen. They were not monsters like the Minotaur. They were skilled warriors, disciplined and determined, fighting on behalf of their queen and their nation. Theseus consulted the oracles and made sacrifices to the gods, seeking divine guidance for how to defeat this unprecedented threat. He sacrificed to Phobos, the personification of fear, asking for courage for his soldiers and terror for his enemies. And finally, in the month that the Athenians would later call Bodromion, meaning the month of running to aid, Theseus led his forces out to face the Amazon army in open battle. The fighting was fierce and bloody. The ancient sources preserve some of the details of the battle, telling us that the Amazon right wing, positioned near the Nyx, actually managed to push the Athenian forces back to the Temple of the Humanities. But the Athenian left, attacking from the museum, drove the Amazon left wing back to their camp. Many warriors fell on both sides, and the Areopagus ran red with blood. And then, in the midst of the battle, tragedy struck. The Amazon queen, the woman Theseus had brought to Athens, was killed. The exact circumstances of her death vary wildly, depending on which source you consult. Some say she was fighting alongside Theseus, defending Athens against her own people, and was struck down by a javelin thrown by an Amazon named Mulpadia. Others claim she was leading the Amazon forces against Theseus, and was killed by his hand when he finally managed to reach her through the press of battle. Still others suggest she was accidentally killed by her sister Penthesilea in the confusion of the fighting. The death of their queen, whether through accident or design, seems to have broken the Amazons' will to continue the siege. With their leader dead and their forces depleted by months of fighting, the warrior women finally agreed to make peace. Some versions say that it was actually the queen herself, before her death, who arranged the peace treaty, using her position as both an Amazon and Theseus's wife to broker an agreement between the two sides. Others say that the remaining Amazon leaders simply recognized that they could not win and agreed to withdraw in exchange for being allowed to take their dead and return home safely. The tombs of the Amazons who fell in this battle could supposedly still be seen in Athens in the time of Plutarch, who wrote about Theseus centuries later. They were scattered throughout the city, physical reminders of this war between Greece and the warrior women of the East. And the battle itself became a favorite subject for Greek artists, appearing on temples, on pottery, and in paintings. The Athenians liked to see themselves as the defenders of civilization against barbarism, and the Amazon invasion provided a perfect example of this theme. It also provided a convenient parallel to the later Persian invasions, allowing the Greeks to frame their victory over Persia in terms of this older mythological victory over the eastern Amazons. For Theseus, the war left complicated feelings and consequences. He had defended his city and preserved Athens' independence, which was undeniably heroic. But he had also lost his Amazon bride, the mother of his son Hippolytus. Whether he had truly loved her or had merely taken her as a trophy of conquest, her death must have affected him, and it left his son motherless, which would contribute to the tragedy that would later engulf Theseus's household. Some sources claim that Theseus never actually married his Amazon captive, that she was merely his concubine or his prisoner, and that her death meant little to him personally. But other traditions speak of a genuine relationship between them, of love growing between captor and captive, of the Amazon queen adapting to life in Athens and Theseus coming to respect and value her, not just as a trophy but as a partner. We will never know the truth of what passed between them, but we can say with certainty that her presence in Athens and the war that followed were pivotal moments in Theseus's life and reign. In the aftermath of the Amazon War, Theseus took steps to honor the warrior women who had died defending their queen. He established festivals and made sacrifices to them, recognizing their courage even though they had been his enemies. This magnanimity in victory was part of what made Theseus a king worth remembering, someone who understood that glory was not just about conquest, but also about honor and respect, even for fallen foes. Brotherhood with Pirate House among all the friendships that the ancient Greeks celebrated in their myths and legends. Few could match the bond between Theseus and Pirate House for sheer audacity and reckless adventure. These two heroes, both claiming descent from the gods, both raised to kingship, both possessed of the same restless energy that drove them to seek glory and excitement, would become brothers in all but blood, their names forever linked in the telling of tales. Pirate House was king of the Labyrinths, a tribe that dwelled in Thessaly in northern Greece, near Mount Pelion, where the centaur Chiron was said to have his cave. His parentage was a matter of some debate, much like Theseus's own. Some sources claimed he was the son of Ixion, a king who had the distinction of being one of the greatest villains in Greek mythology, a man who had tried to seduce Hera herself and had been punished by being bound to a flaming wheel that would roll through the sky for all eternity. Other sources, perhaps trying to distance Pirate House from this infamous parent, claimed that his true father was Zeus, who had seduced Pirate House's mother Dia while disguised as a stallion. The name Pirate House, meaning he who runs around, was said to derive from the circling motion of Zeus in his horse form as he courted Dia. The story of how Theseus and Pirate House first met has become one of the classic tales of friendship in Greek mythology. Pirate House had heard of Theseus, of course. Everyone in Greece had heard of the young king of Athens who had cleared the road of its bandits, who had slain the Minotaur, who had defeated the Amazons. Fame like that spread quickly in the ancient world, growing with each retelling until it was difficult to separate fact from fiction, the man from the legend. Pirate House, young and proud, and perhaps a bit envious of all the attention Theseus was receiving, decided he wanted to test this famous hero for himself. He wanted to see if Theseus was truly as brave and strong as the stories claimed, or if his reputation had grown larger than the man himself. So, Pirate House devised a plan that was either brilliantly clever or incredibly foolish, depending on how you look at it. He would steal Theseus's cattle. The theft itself was brazen and public. Pirate House drove a herd of cattle away from Marathon, the same region where Theseus had captured the famous bull, and he made no attempt to hide what he had done or who he was. He wanted Theseus to know that it was Pirate House, king of the Labyrinths, who had rustled his cattle. He wanted to provoke a response, to force a confrontation. Theseus, of course, could not let such an insult stand. A king who allowed his cattle to be stolen without response would be seen as weak, and weakness invited challenges to one's authority. So Theseus gathered his weapons and set out in pursuit of the cattle thief, determined to make this Pirate House regret his audacity. Pirate House, meanwhile, was waiting for him. When he heard that Theseus was coming, he turned back to face the Athenian king. The two heroes met on the road somewhere between Athens and Thessaly, and both drew their weapons, preparing to fight. By all rights, this should have ended in bloodshed, with one king or the other lying dead on the road, and the victor claiming both glory and cattle. But then something remarkable happened. As Theseus and Pirate House faced each other, sizing each other up, preparing to engage in combat, each hero was struck by the bearing and appearance of the other. Theseus saw in Pirate House a warrior equal to himself, someone who radiated strength and courage, and that indefinable quality that marks a true hero. Pirate House, for his part, saw that all the stories about Theseus were true, that this was indeed a man of exceptional ability and character, someone who had earned his fame through genuine deed rather than mere boasting. Instead of fighting, both men suddenly lowered their weapons. Pirate House, in a gesture that must have seemed shocking to anyone who witnessed it, extended his hand in friendship to Theseus. "Judge me yourself," he said, offering to accept whatever punishment Theseus deemed appropriate for the theft of the cattle. But Theseus, equally moved by the nobility and courage of this gesture, refused to exact any penalty. Instead, he proposed something that would prove far more valuable than revenge: an oath of friendship, a bond that would make them brothers in spirit, if not in blood. Right there on the road, the two heroes swore an oath of eternal friendship. They bound themselves to each other with vows that invoked the gods as witnesses, promising to stand by each other through whatever trials might come, to share in each other's triumphs and disasters, to be true friends until death and beyond. It was the kind of friendship that the ancient Greeks especially valued, a bond between equals that was almost sacred in its intensity and commitment. This friendship would be tested many times in the years that followed, and more than once, it would lead both heroes into situations where perhaps wiser men would have feared to go. But that was the nature of Theseus and Pirate House. They were not wise men. They were heroes driven by that combination of courage, ambition, and recklessness that defines the breed. Their first great adventure together came when Pirate House prepared to marry Hippodamia, a princess whose name meant horse tamer, and who was, by all accounts, a woman worthy of a king. Pirithous invited all the great heroes and kings of Greece to his wedding, wanting to celebrate his marriage in proper fashion. Among the guests were many of the Argonauts who had sailed with Jason to steal the Golden Fleece, including Theseus himself. But Pirithous also extended invitations to the centaurs, those half-man, half-horse beings who lived in the mountains and forests of Thessaly. The centaurs were an interesting addition to the guest list. They were, in most cases, savage and uncivilized creatures, more beast than man in their behavior and appetites. There were a few exceptions, most notably Chiron, who was wise and gentle and had taught many heroes, including perhaps Theseus himself. But most centaurs were known for their violence, their drunkenness, and their lust. Inviting them to a wedding was either a gesture of remarkable inclusivity or a terrible mistake, and it turned out to be the latter. The wedding feast was laid out with the kind of abundance that befitted such an occasion. There was roasted meat and fresh bread, fruits and cheeses, and, most important for what would follow, amphoras upon amphoras of wine. Now, wine in the ancient Greek world was not consumed in the way we might drink it today. The Greeks always mixed their wine with water, usually in a ratio of 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine. To drink wine unmixed was considered barbaric and dangerous, a quick route to drunkenness and the loss of civilized behavior. But the centaurs, who had little experience with wine and even less understanding of Greek customs regarding its consumption, began drinking the wine unmixed and in huge quantities. As they grew increasingly drunk, their behavior became more and more outrageous. They began insulting the other guests, breaking the furniture, behaving with the kind of rudeness that would have resulted in their expulsion if they hadn't been so physically powerful and numerous. And then, drunk beyond reason and consumed by their baser instincts, the centaurs began to attack the women present at the feast. They grabbed at the female guests, trying to drag them away, and Eurytion, or Eurytus, depending on the source, the leader of the centaurs, actually seized Hippodamia herself, the bride, and attempted to carry her off. This was the breaking point. Whatever hospitality Pirithous had extended to the centaurs, whatever desire he had to include them in his celebration, was forgotten in the face of this outrage. Pirithous and the other heroes present, including Theseus, immediately leaped into action. They grabbed whatever weapons were at hand, and a brutal battle erupted right there in the middle of the wedding feast. The Centauromachy, as this battle came to be known, was fierce and bloody. The centaurs were powerful and savage, using their superior strength and their ability to kick with their hind legs to devastating effect. But the heroes, despite being somewhat drunk themselves from the celebrations, were disciplined warriors with superior weapons and tactics. The wooden clubs and bare hands of the centaurs could not stand against bronze swords and spears wielded by the finest warriors of Greece. The battle raged throughout the hall and spilled out into the surrounding countryside. Theseus was said to have fought with particular distinction, using both his sword and the bronze club he had taken from Periphetes to beat back the centaurs. Pirithous fought to defend his bride and his home, and the other heroes rallied to his aid. One by one, the centaurs fell. Some were killed outright, their bodies lying scattered across the battlefield. Others were driven from the hall and fled into the mountains, never to return to civilized lands. By the time the fighting ended, many centaurs lay dead, and those who survived were scattered and leaderless. The wedding of Pirithous and Hippodamia had been saved, though it had turned from a celebration into a massacre. The Centauromachy would become one of the most popular subjects in Greek art, appearing on temples, in sculptures, and on countless vases. It represented the triumph of civilization over barbarism, of human reason and discipline over animalistic lust and violence. For Theseus and Pirithous, the battle deepened their friendship even further. They had fought side by side, had saved each other's lives multiple times during the fighting, had proven that their oath of brotherhood was not just empty words, but a bond sealed in blood and battle. From that day forward, they would be inseparable companions in adventure, each ready to support the other no matter how dangerous or foolish the enterprise might be. And they would need that mutual support for what came next. For the friendship between Theseus and Pirithous would soon lead them into adventures that were not just dangerous but bordered on the insane. Adventures involving the abduction of the most beautiful woman in the world, and a doomed attempt to steal the wife of the god of death himself. But before we get to those stories, we should speak of another companion who traveled with them on some of these adventures. Another figure who would play an important role in the mythology of ancient Greece. The famous Caledonian boar hunt, where Theseus and Pirithous would join with other heroes, including Meleager, Atalanta, and Jason, in pursuing a monstrous boar sent by Artemis to ravage the land of Caledon. The friendship between Theseus and Pirithous thus became the stuff of legend, a bond so strong that it would survive even the attempt to descend into the underworld itself. They were brothers in all but blood, partners in adventure, and their names would be forever linked in the stories told by generation after generation of Greeks who valued friendship above almost all other virtues. The Helen affair after Pirithous married Hippodamia and settled into his role as king of the Labyrinth, life might have become quiet and domestic for the two heroes. But Theseus and Pirithous were not the sort of men who could remain content with a quiet domesticity for long. They were still young, still hungry for glory and adventure, still possessed of that particular blend of courage and hubris that led heroes to attempt the impossible. Tragedy struck when Hippodamia died, though the sources disagree on exactly how this came about. Some say she died in childbirth, giving Pirithous a son named Polypoetes who would later fight at Troy. Others suggest different causes for her untimely death. But regardless of how it happened, Pirithous found himself a widower, and his thoughts turned to finding a new wife. Around the same time, Theseus's Amazon bride, the mother of Hippolytus, had also died, killed during the Amazon invasion of Athens. So both heroes found themselves without wives, both still in the prime of their lives, both kings who needed heirs to secure their lines of succession. As they discussed their situation, an idea began to form, an idea that was ambitious and audacious even by their standards. "We are not ordinary men," one of them must have said. Perhaps Pirithous, perhaps Theseus. "We are sons of gods, kings, heroes whose deeds are already the stuff of legend. Should we marry ordinary women no matter how beautiful or well-born? Shouldn't our wives be worthy of us? Shouldn't we aim for something better? something that matches our own exceptional natures. And so they made a pact, or perhaps more accurately, a challenge to each other. Each would marry a daughter of Zeus himself, the king of the gods, not the divine daughters who lived on Olympus. For even Theseus and Pirate House were not so mad as to think they could woo Athena or Artemis or any of the other goddesses. But Zeus had many mortal daughters as well, women of exceptional beauty and noble lineage, and it was these daughters the two heroes set their sights on. Theseus chose Helen, though at this time she was still a child, perhaps only 7 or 10 years old, depending on which ancient source you consult. She was the daughter of Zeus by Leda, the wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta, and even in her youth it was clear that she would grow up to be extraordinarily beautiful. In fact, Helen would later be called the most beautiful woman in the world, the face that launched 1,000 ships, though that part of her story was still far in the future when Theseus first set eyes on her. The plan, as Theseus explained it to Pirate House, was not to marry Helen immediately. Even he recognized that a child of 7 or 10 was too young for marriage. Instead, he would abduct her from Sparta and keep her in Athens until she reached marriageable age. Then, when she was ready, he would make her his queen, and their children would have the blood of Athens' royal line, of Poseidon through Theseus, and of Zeus himself through Helen. Pirate House agreed to help his friend with this abduction, and in return, Theseus agreed to help Pirithous with his own choice of bride, and Pirithous, perhaps trying to one-up his friend, perhaps simply driven by his own hubris and recklessness, chose as his target Persephone, the daughter of Zeus by Demeter and the wife of Hades, queen of the underworld itself. If anyone had taken a moment to think about this plan rationally, they might have raised several objections. Abducting a child from Sparta would almost certainly provoke war with one of the most powerful military states in Greece, and attempting to steal the wife of the god of death from the underworld itself was not just dangerous but blasphemous, an act of such enormous hubris that it had practically begged for divine punishment. But Theseus and Pirate House were young and confident, and had overcome so many challenges already that they believed nothing was beyond their capabilities, so they set out for Sparta, traveling with a small group of trusted companions. When they reached the city, they had to be clever, for Sparta was well defended, and Helen was the daughter of the king, protected by guards and attendants. But the two heroes had not survived their previous ventures through strength alone. They were also capable of stealth and cunning when the situation called for it. Some versions of the story say that Helen was dancing at the temple of Artemis Orthia when Theseus and Pirate House struck. They swooped in, grabbed the young girl, and fled before the alarm could be raised. Others say they took her while she was walking in the countryside outside the city, or that they found her at the gymnasium, where Spartan children, both boys and girls, trained in athletics and military exercises. The exact circumstances matter less than the result. The two heroes successfully abducted Helen and spirited her away before the Spartans could mount an effective pursuit. They brought Helen to the town of Aphidnae in Attica, not far from Athens, and left her in the care of Theseus's mother Aethra. Theseus promised that he would return to marry Helen once she had grown to proper age. But first, he had to fulfill his part of the bargain with Pirate House. He had to help his friend descend to the underworld and attempt to steal Persephone from Hades. Before they left on this insane quest, Theseus took one more precaution. He and Pirithous drew lots to determine which of them would attempt to seduce Persephone first. Theseus had no intention of actually pursuing the Queen of the Dead himself, but by drawing lots, he and Pirithous maintained the fiction that this was a sporting competition rather than pure hubris. Pirithous, unsurprisingly, drew the lot that obligated him to be the primary suitor. Meanwhile, back in Sparta, the abduction of Helen had caused exactly the kind of uproar that a rational person might have expected. Helen's twin brothers, Castor and Pollux, known together as the Dioscuri, were legendary heroes in their own right. Castor was a famous horseman, Pollux an unbeatable boxer, and both were fierce in their protection of their family. When they discovered that their sister had been kidnapped and taken to Athens, they raised an army and prepared to march on Attica. But Theseus was no longer in Athens. He had left the city in the hands of Mnestheus, a descendant of Erechtheus who had his own ambitions regarding the throne of Athens, and had descended into the underworld with Pirithous. This left Athens vulnerable, and the Dioscuri, being skilled commanders as well as warriors, took full advantage of the situation. The twin brothers invaded Attica with their Spartan forces and began systematically searching for their sister. They came to Athens itself and demanded that Helen be returned to them. Mnestheus, seeing an opportunity to advance his own position, cooperated with the Spartans, perhaps even helping them locate Helen in Aphidnae. When the Dioscuri found Helen at Aphidnae, they rescued her and prepared to return her to Sparta. But they weren't done exacting vengeance for the insult Theseus had paid them. As retribution for the abduction of their sister, they took Theseus's mother Aethra and forced her to become Helen's slave. Poor Aethra, who had raised Theseus in Trojan and had been the instrument of revealing his heritage to him, now found herself serving the very girl her son had abducted. She would remain Helen's slave for many years, until the Trojan War, when Theseus's sons would finally free her. Moreover, the Dioscuri used their position of strength to interfere in Athenian politics. They installed Mnestheus as king of Athens in place of Theseus, who was considered to have abandoned his city and forfeited his right to rule. Mnestheus was happy to accept this arrangement, and he would rule Athens until Theseus eventually returned from his disastrous journey to the underworld. The abduction of Helen, brief though her captivity was, would have lasting consequences far beyond what Theseus could have imagined. It created enmity between Athens and Sparta that would simmer for generations, contributing to the later conflicts between these two great city-states. It resulted in the displacement of Theseus from his throne, at least temporarily, and it left Aethra enslaved, a woman who had done nothing wrong being punished for her son's arrogance and poor judgment. As for Helen herself, her story was only beginning. She would return to Sparta, grow to womanhood, and become so beautiful that every prince and king in Greece would compete for her hand in marriage. She would eventually marry Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon and a powerful king in his own right. And then, years later, she would be carried off again, this time by Paris of Troy, and her abduction would spark the most famous war in all of Greek mythology. Some ancient writers speculated about whether Theseus's earlier abduction of Helen had influenced her later willingness to go with Paris. Had she learned that she was valuable, that men would fight wars to possess her, that her beauty gave her a kind of power? Or had the trauma of being kidnapped as a child left her vulnerable to Paris's seductions? We can never know the answers to these questions. But the connection between Theseus's youthful foolishness and Helen's later role in the Trojan War is one that ancient audiences would have recognized and appreciated. For now, though, Helen was safe back in Sparta, and Theseus faced far more immediate problems. He was trapped in the underworld, held there by the power of Hades, paying the price for his hubris and his reckless promise to help Pirithous steal the god of death's own wife. And before we can continue with Theseus' story, we must follow him down into those dark realms beneath the earth, where he would face his greatest test and where Pirithous would meet his final fate. This is the third journey to the underworld. The descent into the underworld was not something to be undertaken lightly. The ancient Greeks believed that beneath the world of the living lay a shadowy realm ruled by Hades, the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, and his wife Persephone. This was where mortal souls went after death, crossing the river Styx and being judged by the three judges of the dead. Most souls went to the Asphodel Meadows, a gray and joyless place where they wandered as shadows of their former selves. The truly wicked were sent to Tartarus to suffer eternal punishments, while the exceptionally heroic or virtuous might be sent to Elysium, where they could enjoy something like eternal paradise. But the underworld was not meant for the living. To go there while still breathing was to violate the natural order, to transgress against the fundamental boundaries that separated life from death. Only a handful of heroes had ever attempted it and survived. Orpheus had gone down to retrieve his wife, Eurydice, and had failed. Heracles would later descend as part of his 12th labor to capture Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates. But when Theseus and Pirithous made their attempt, they were venturing into territory where even gods feared to tread. Some sources provide details about how they made their descent. There were said to be certain caves and chasms where the underworld came close to the surface, places where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew thin. One such place was at Tainarum in southern Greece, where a cave was said to lead down into Hades' kingdom. Perhaps it was through such a cave that Theseus and Pirithous made their journey, descending through winding passages that led ever downward, the light of the sun growing dimmer and dimmer until they walked in near total darkness. As they descended, they would have encountered the various features of the underworld that Homer and other poets described. They would have seen the rivers that separated the living from the dead, the Styx by which the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths, the Acheron, the river of woe, the Costus, the river of lamentation, the Phlegethon, whose waters burned with fire, and the Lethe, whose waters brought forgetfulness to those who drank from them. They would have had to find some way to cross these rivers, perhaps convincing Charon, the ancient ferryman, to carry them across the Styx despite the fact that they still lived and breathed. Perhaps they bribed him with coins, or perhaps they used force to compel him. Either way, they made it past this first obstacle and continued deeper into the realm of death. Eventually, they reached the court of Hades himself, the palace where the god of the underworld sat on his throne, with Persephone beside him, ruling over the countless dead who had passed into their domain. Now, Hades was not evil in the way we might understand the term today. He was not the devil or some figure of absolute malevolence. He was simply the administrator of death, carrying out the function that had been assigned to him when the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, had divided up the cosmos after defeating the Titans. Zeus had taken the sky, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the underworld. It was a thankless job, and Hades was often grim and stern, but he was not unnecessarily cruel. When Theseus and Pirithous arrived in his court, Hades must have been intrigued. It was not every day that living mortals walked into his realm voluntarily. He could have simply destroyed them on the spot, or commanded his minions to tear them apart. But instead, he decided to play a more subtle game. He welcomed them as if they were honored guests and invited them to sit down and rest from their long journey. The god of death had prepared seats for them, 2 chairs positioned prominently in his court, and Theseus and Pirithous, exhausted from their descent and perhaps lulled by Hades's apparently friendly reception, sat down without suspicion. It was the last free movement they would make for a very long time. The chairs to which Hades had directed them were magical, cursed objects that would not release anyone who sat upon them. The moment Theseus and Pirithous settled onto these seats, they found themselves unable to rise. Their bodies were held fast, whether by physical bonds that grew out of the chairs themselves, or by some magical force that pinned them in place. They were trapped, and Hades, his expression perhaps showing grim satisfaction, revealed that he had known their purpose all along. "You came to steal my wife," he said, and his voice must have been cold as the grave. "You thought you could simply walk into my realm and take Persephone from me. Your arrogance is remarkable, but also foolish. Did you really think that I would not know? That I would not be prepared?" And then, to compound their misery, the Erinyes appeared, the Furies, those ancient spirits of vengeance with snakes writhing in their hair, torches and whips in their hands. They surrounded Theseus and Pirithous, tormenting them, reminding them of their crimes and their hubris. These were the same beings who had driven Orestes mad after he killed his mother, the same spirits who punished oathbreakers and those who committed crimes against the natural order. And what greater crime against the natural order could there be than trying to steal the queen of the underworld? So Theseus and Pirithous sat in those cursed chairs, unable to move, unable to escape, tormented by the Furies and by their own thoughts. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Time moves strangely in the underworld, and for the two heroes, their imprisonment must have felt like an eternity. They had entered Hades' realm as proud heroes, convinced of their own power and importance, certain that nothing could stop them. Now they were reduced to helpless prisoners, paying the price for their arrogance. Some versions of the story say that while they sat there, their flesh began to merge with the stone of the chairs, their bodies becoming part of the furniture, a grotesque fusion of living flesh and dead rock. They remained conscious, aware of their predicament, but unable to do anything about it. They could only watch the endless parade of dead souls passing through Hades' court, each one a reminder of the mortality they had tried to transcend. Back in the world above, life continued without them. Athens was now ruled by Mnestheus, who made the most of Theseus's absence to consolidate his own power. Helen had been rescued by her brothers and returned to Sparta. The people of Athens and Thessaly assumed that their kings were dead, lost in whatever mad adventure they had undertaken. But Theseus and Pirithous were not dead, merely trapped, and eventually salvation would come from an unexpected source. Heracles, that greatest of all Greek heroes, was tasked with his 12th labor to descend into the underworld and capture Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to Hades' realm. When Heracles made his descent, following the same paths that Theseus and Pirithous had taken months or years before, he eventually came to the court of Hades. Heracles, being Heracles, did not bother with subtlety or deception. He simply demanded that Hades allow him to take Cerberus to the upper world, and Hades, perhaps amused by this brash hero's audacity, or perhaps simply tired of constantly having to deal with living intruders in his realm, agreed on the condition that Heracles could overpower the beast without using weapons. Heracles accepted this challenge and succeeded in wrestling Cerberus into submission. But before he left the underworld with his prize, Heracles noticed Theseus and Pirithous sitting in their cursed chairs, still held fast after all this time. He recognized them, for they were all part of the same generation of heroes, all part of the great company of Argonauts and adventurers who had sailed with Jason or hunted the Caledonian boar. And Heracles, for all his legendary strength and pride, was also known for his loyalty to his companions. He went to the chairs and grasped Theseus's hand, then pulled with all his tremendous might. The chair resisted, not wanting to release its prisoner, and the earth itself seemed to shake with the strain of Heracles pulling against the underworld's power. But Heracles was the son of Zeus, the strongest man who had ever lived, and slowly, inch by inch, he managed to wrench Theseus free from the chair's grip. But Theseus paid a price for his rescue. The ancient sources tell us with grim humor that when Heracles finally pulled him free, Theseus left behind the flesh of his buttocks, which remained stuck to the chair. From that day forward, Theseus was said to have a lean posterior, and supposedly, this was why the people of Athens tended to have skinny hips, because they inherited this trait from their founding hero. It's a detail that adds a touch of dark comedy to what was otherwise a harrowing ordeal. Having freed Theseus, Heracles then turned his attention to Pirithous. He grasped the Labyrinth king's hand and pulled with the same tremendous force he had used to free Theseus. But this time, the underworld would not yield. When Heracles tried to free Pirithous, the ground beneath their feet began to shake violently, as if the entire underworld were about to collapse. It was a warning from Hades, or from the cosmos itself, that Pirithous had gone too far, that his crime of trying to steal Persephone was too great to be forgiven. Heracles, for all his strength, knew when he was beaten. He released Pirithous and stepped back. And Theseus, understanding that his friend was doomed, had to make the agonizing decision to leave Pirithous behind. The Labyrinth king would remain in the underworld forever, still bound to that cursed chair, still tormented by the Furies, paying eternally for his hubris in daring to desire the queen of the dead. Theseus accompanied Heracles back to the surface, back to the world of sunlight and life, leaving his friend behind in the darkness. It was a bitter homecoming. He had survived where House had not, but at what cost? He had lost his closest friend, the brother he had sworn eternal loyalty to, and he was returning to an Athens that had moved on without him, where another king now sat on his throne, and where his former subjects believed him dead or lost. The descent into the underworld was the turning point in Theseus's life, the moment when his luck began to turn, when his string of victories and triumphs gave way to tragedy and decline. He had entered Hades' realm as a confident hero, certain of his own power and invincibility. He emerged as a chastened, wounded man who had learned the hard lesson that there are limits even to what heroes can accomplish, that some boundaries should not be crossed, that hubris will eventually be punished by the gods. King and unifier, before Theseus's disastrous journey to the underworld, he had not merely been a hero and adventurer, but also a king, and by most accounts, a good one. His greatest achievement as ruler of Athens was not military in nature, nor did it involve slaying monsters or winning glory in battle. Rather, it was a political and social accomplishment that would have lasting effects on the development of Athens as a city-state. This was the synoikismos, the dwelling together, the unification of the scattered communities of Attica under the single authority of Athens. When Theseus first became king after his father Aegeus's death, Athens was just one of many small towns and settlements scattered across the region of Attica. Each community had its own local government, its own traditions, its own sense of identity. There was no unified Athenian state, no single political entity that could speak for all the people of the region. This fragmentation made Attica weak, vulnerable to external threats and unable to coordinate effective responses to crises. Theseus understood that this situation had to change if Athens was to become a major power in Greece, if it was to stand as an equal to Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and the other great city-states. It needed to unify the disparate communities of Attica under a single government. This was a revolutionary idea in its time, requiring not just military force, but also diplomatic skill, persuasion, and political innovation. The synoikismos that Theseus implemented involved convincing or compelling all the independent towns and villages of Attica to give up their local autonomy and submit to the authority of Athens. The town halls and local governments that had operated in places like Eleusis, Marathon, and dozens of smaller settlements were dissolved. In their place, Theseus established Athens as the sole seat of government for all of Attica. But Theseus was clever enough to understand that simply imposing central authority by force would create resentment and resistance. So he sweetened the deal for the local populations. All the people of Attica were now declared to be Athenians, with equal rights and equal participation in the governance of the unified state. It didn't matter whether someone came from one of the old aristocratic families of Athens itself, or was a farmer from a tiny village in the countryside. All were now citizens of Athens with the same legal status and the same voice in public affairs. This was a radical innovation for its time. Most Greek city-states were hierarchical, with clear distinctions between the people of the central city and those who lived in the surrounding territory. But Theseus's Athens offered something different, a kind of primitive democracy that would later be developed and refined into the famous Athenian democracy of the classical period. According to Plutarch and other ancient historians, Theseus divided the population of Athens into three classes, creating a social structure that would help manage the newly unified state. The first class was the Eupatridae, the aristocracy, the noble families who could trace their lineage back to Athens' legendary founders. These men would be responsible for religious affairs and for interpreting the laws and customs of the city. The second class was the Geomori, the farmers and landowners who worked the fields and produced the food that sustained the city. They were free citizens with full rights, not serfs or slaves, and they formed the backbone of Athenian society. The third class was the demiurgoi, the craftsmen and artisans who produced the goods that made civilization possible. The potters who made the famous Athenian pottery, the smiths who forged weapons and tools, the builders who constructed houses and temples, the shipwrights who built the vessels that would later make Athens a naval power. This threefold division was not about creating rigid castes or permanent inequality. Rather, it was about recognizing that different people contributed to the city in different ways, and that all these contributions were valuable and necessary. The aristocrats provided leadership and continuity with tradition. The farmers provided sustenance. The craftsmen provided the material goods that made civilized life possible. All three classes were citizens with rights and voices in the governance of Athens. To symbolize and celebrate this new unity, Theseus established the festival of Panathenaea, which brought together people from all across Attica to celebrate their shared identity as Athenians. This festival would continue for centuries, becoming one of the most important religious and civic events in the Athenian calendar. It included athletic competitions, religious processions, and the presentation of a new peplos, a sacred robe to the statue of Athena in her temple on the Acropolis. Theseus also established the Isthmian Games, or, according to some sources, he reformed and expanded games that had already existed. These athletic competitions, held near Corinth at the isthmus that connected the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, were dedicated to Poseidon and became one of the four great Pan-Hellenic festivals of ancient Greece, along with the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games at Delphi, and the Nemean Games. The Sinoikismos was not just about internal organization. By unifying Attica, Theseus created a much more powerful state that could project military force and a political influence far beyond what the scattered villages had been capable of. The territory of Athens now extended from the coast of the Saronic Gulf all the way to the Isthmus of Corinth. This gave Athens control over a significant amount of agricultural land, access to multiple harbors, and a population large enough to field substantial military forces. Theseus also took steps to make Athens a center of culture and learning, not just military power. He welcomed foreigners to settle in Athens, offering them the opportunity to become citizens if they were artisans with valuable skills. This policy of openness and inclusion would later contribute to Athens' reputation as a cosmopolitan city, a place where ideas and innovations from all over the Greek world came together and synthesized into something new. Under Theseus's rule, Athens began the transformation that would eventually make it the cultural and intellectual capital of Greece, the city that would later produce Socrates and Plato, Aeschylus and Sophocles, the Parthenon, and the principles of democratic government. owed much of its foundation to the political innovations that Theseus had implemented during his reign. But there was a dark side to this story of enlightened political reform. The ancient sources are somewhat contradictory about Theseus's character as a ruler. Some portray him as the ideal king, wise and just, always acting in the best interest of his people, but others suggest that he could be autocratic and imperious, too convinced of his own superiority to listen to advice from others. The Palantidae, those sons of Pallas who had challenged Aegeus for the throne, were certainly not happy with Theseus's rule. Even after Theseus had defeated them in battle, resentment continued to simmer. They believed that they had a better claim to the throne than this supposed son of Aegeus, who had appeared out of nowhere from Troezen. And there were others in Athens who shared their skepticism about Theseus's legitimacy, or who chafed under his rule. Moreover, Theseus's frequent absences from Athens on his various adventures created problems for governance. A king who was constantly sailing off to fight Amazons or descend into the underworld could not provide the steady, consistent leadership that the city needed. This was especially true after the Sinoikismos, when the newly unified state required careful management to ensure that all the different communities felt properly represented and that local tensions did not flare into violence. Mnestheus, that descendant of Erechtheus, who would later be installed as king by the Dioscuri, was particularly skilled at exploiting these grievances. He went around Athens speaking to anyone who would listen, pointing out Theseus's flaws and failures as a ruler. He reminded people that Theseus had dissolved their local governments without really consulting them, that he had taken away their autonomy and forced them to submit to the authority of Athens. He suggested that Theseus was a tyrant in all but name, using his reputation as a hero to justify his autocratic rule. These criticisms were not entirely unfair. Theseus had indeed centralized power in Athens and reduced the autonomy of the other communities in Attica. And while he had granted citizenship and rights to all the people of the region, he had done so in a way that made them dependent on Athens and on his own authority as king. It was, in many ways, a benevolent dictatorship, and while it might have been more enlightened than many governments of his time, it was still a dictatorship. The political reforms that Theseus implemented would have lasting effects on Athens's development, but they were also fragile, dependent on the personal authority and charisma of the king himself. When Theseus finally returned from the underworld to find that Mnestheus had taken his throne, and that the people of Athens had accepted this change, he learned the hard lesson that political legitimacy is always provisional, always dependent on the consent of the governed, and that even heroes can lose their crowns if they are gone too long or if they alienate too many of their subjects. Phaedra's curse. The tragedy that would eventually drive Theseus into exile began, as so many Greek tragedies do, with love, or perhaps more accurately with lust, and with the complicated relationships that arise in blended families. After his Amazon bride died, and after he returned from his descent into the underworld, Theseus took a new wife. Her name was Phaedra, and she was a Cretan princess, a daughter of King Minos, and thus the sister of Ariadne, that woman Theseus had abandoned on the island of Naxos after she helped him escape the Labyrinth. One might think that Minos would hardly be inclined to give another daughter to the man who had killed his monster, seduced one daughter and then abandoned her, and who had ended the tribute that Minos had extracted from Athens. But Minos was dead by this time, in some sources killed during a naval expedition against Sicily, others saying he died of natural causes. And his successor, perhaps a son named Deucalion, saw advantages in making peace with Athens and sealing that peace through marriage. For Theseus, the marriage to Phaedra served several purposes. It formally ended any remaining hostilities between Athens and Crete, securing Athens' position in the Aegean. It provided him with a new wife from a noble family, important for a king who needed heirs. And perhaps there was even some genuine affection or attraction between them, though the sources don't say much about the early years of their marriage. Phaedra bore Theseus 2 sons, Demophon and Acamas, who would later play important roles in the Trojan War. By all accounts, the family seemed happy at first. Phaedra was queen of Athens, mother of the king's sons, and presumably secure in her position. But there was a complication in the household, a young man whose presence would ultimately bring disaster to them all. This was Hippolytus, Theseus' son, by his Amazon bride. He was now a young man, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, and he had grown up to be exceptionally beautiful. He was tall and athletic, with the physical grace that came from his Amazon blood and the strength that came from his father's divine heritage. But Hippolytus had no interest in the things that typically occupied young men of his age and station. He cared nothing for politics or warfare, and most significantly, he had no interest in love or romance. Instead, Hippolytus had devoted himself entirely to the goddess Artemis, the virgin huntress, daughter of Zeus and twin sister of Apollo. Artemis represented wilderness, chastity, and the hunt, and Hippolytus served her with absolute devotion. He spent his days in the forests and mountains around Athens, hunting deer and boar, making offerings at Artemis's shrines, and maintaining his virginity in honor of the goddess he served. This devotion to Artemis meant that Hippolytus neglected to honor Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire. He made no offerings at her altars, participated in none of her festivals, and openly scorned those who did. He believed that love and lust were degrading, that they reduced people to the level of animals driven by base instinct rather than elevated by reason and piety. In his mind, he was honoring the gods properly by dedicating himself to Artemis's service and maintaining his purity. But Aphrodite, like most of the Olympian gods, did not take kindly to being ignored or insulted. She was vain and proud, and when Hippolytus openly declared his disdain for her and all she represented, the goddess decided to teach him a terrible lesson. She would use love, that thing he scorned, to destroy him utterly, and the instrument of that destruction would be his own stepmother. Aphrodite struck Phaedra with an overwhelming, uncontrollable passion for Hippolytus. One moment, Phaedra saw her stepson as simply a member of the household, perhaps with some mild affection, as one might have for any young relative. The next moment, she was consumed with desire for him, unable to think of anything but him, unable to sleep or eat. Her whole existence suddenly centered on this impossible longing. Phaedra, to her credit, understood how wrong this was. Hippolytus was her stepson in many ways, more like a son to her than her own children, since he was older and had been part of the household longer. For her to desire him was not just impractical or inappropriate, It was incestuous, a violation of the most fundamental taboos that govern family relationships. Moreover, he had made it abundantly clear through his devotion to Artemis that he had no interest in any romantic or sexual relationship with anyone. So Phaedra fought against the desire that Aphrodite had inflicted upon her. She tried to suppress it, to ignore it, to overcome it through force of will. She stopped eating and grew thin and pale. She couldn't sleep, and when she did, she was tormented by dreams. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed the change in their queen, worried about her health, and tried to discover what was troubling her. But Phaedra would not tell them, could not bring herself to speak the shameful truth. This situation continued for some time, with Phaedra becoming more and more ill, wasting away from her impossible love until finally she confided in her nurse, an old woman who had known her since childhood. The nurse was shocked by this confession, but she was also practical and determined to help her mistress. She decided, against Phaedra's wishes, to approach Hippolytus and reveal the queen's love to him, perhaps hoping that he would take pity on Phaedra, or that he could be persuaded to reciprocate her feelings, or at least that bringing the matter into the open would somehow resolve it. But the nurse badly miscalculated. When she approached Hippolytus and told him of Phaedra's love, he reacted with absolute horror and revulsion. To him, this was the ultimate proof of the degradation that love and desire brought to people. His stepmother, who should have been devoted to her husband and her children, had instead become consumed by lust for him. Her stepson, it was exactly the kind of shameful, animalistic behavior that he had dedicated his life to avoiding. Hippolytus's reaction was not gentle or understanding. He raged against Phaedra, against women in general, against the very concept of love and desire. He declared that he would expose this shameful situation to his father, that he would make sure everyone knew what Phaedra had done. The nurse, realizing the disaster she had precipitated, fled back to tell Phaedra what had happened. Phaedra, hearing that Hippolytus now knew of her love, and that he was planning to tell Theseus, was overcome with shame and despair. She saw no way out of the situation. If Theseus learned of her love for Hippolytus, he would surely cast her out, or perhaps even kill her for this betrayal. Her sons would be disgraced, their claims to the throne compromised by their mother's scandal. She would become a figure of mockery and contempt, remembered forever as the queen who lusted after her stepson. So Phaedra made a terrible decision. She decided to take her own life, but not before taking steps to protect her reputation and her son's futures. She wrote a letter to Theseus, a false letter claiming that Hippolytus had raped her or tried to rape her, that he had violated the sanctity of his father's house and his father's marriage. Then, with this letter in hand, she went to her chambers and hanged herself. When Theseus returned to his palace, he found his wife dead, discovered the letter, and was filled with rage and grief. He believed Phaedra's lie absolutely, never suspecting that his wife might have fabricated the accusation to hide her own shameful love. All he knew was that his son, his own flesh and blood, had supposedly violated his wife, had brought this ultimate dishonor to their house. In his fury, Theseus called upon his father Poseidon to punish Hippolytus. Long ago, Poseidon had promised Theseus 3 wishes, 3 times when the god would grant whatever Theseus asked. Theseus had never used any of these wishes before, had saved them for some moment of desperate need. Now, consumed by anger and grief, he spent one of those precious wishes asking Poseidon to kill his son. Hippolytus, meanwhile, was fleeing Athens. Perhaps he had learned of Phaedra's death and suspected what had happened. Perhaps he simply wanted to get away from the situation, knowing that his father would be furious when he heard what Phaedra had claimed. He climbed onto his chariot and raced along the coastal road that led south from Athens, driving his team of horses at breakneck speed. As he drove, Poseidon answered his son Theseus's prayer in the most terrible way possible. The god sent a massive bull up from the sea, a creature that echoed the marathon bull that Theseus had once captured, but was even more fearsome, more supernatural. This bull emerged from the waves with a roar that shook the earth, and it charged at Hippolytus's chariot. The horses, seeing this monster, panicked completely. They reared and bolted, dragging the chariot wildly off the road. Hippolytus, though an expert horseman and charioteer, could not control them. The chariot struck rocks and trees, bouncing and careening along, until finally it shattered. Hippolytus was thrown clear, but the reins had wrapped around his body, and he was dragged behind the stampeding horses, his body battered against rocks and torn by thorns, until he was barely recognizable as human. By the time the horses finally stopped and Hippolytus's mangled body was recovered, it was clear he was dying. Servants carried him back to Athens, and there, at last, the truth came out. Either through divine intervention or through someone who had witnessed what actually happened between Phaedra and Hippolytus, Theseus learned that his son had been innocent, that Phaedra had lied to protect her reputation, that he'd killed his own blameless son for a crime he had never committed. The realization was devastating. Theseus had lost his wife and his son in the same day, and his son's death was on his own hands. He had called down the curse that killed Hippolytus. He had been the instrument of this tragedy, manipulated by Aphrodite's vengeance against the young man who had scorned her. Some versions of the story provide a small measure of consolation. In these accounts, Artemis herself appeared to Theseus and Hippolytus in the moments before the young man's death. She explained the whole truth of what had happened, how Aphrodite had cursed Phaedra with the impossible love as revenge against Hippolytus. She told Theseus that his son had been devoted and pure, that he had lived as a perfect servant to his goddess, and she promised that Hippolytus would be honored, that young girls would dedicate locks of their hair to him before their weddings, and that he would be remembered always as a model of piety and chastity. But these consolations, if they existed, could not undo the tragedy. Theseus had destroyed his own household through his rash anger and his willingness to believe the worst of his son. The palace that had once been filled with family now echoed with absence and loss. And the people of Athens, hearing of these disasters, began to wonder whether Theseus was still fit to rule, whether a king who brought such tragedy upon his own house could be trusted to lead the city. Exile and death, the tragedy of Phaedra and Hippolytus, marked a turning point in how the people of Athens viewed their king. Theseus, who had once been hailed as the greatest hero of the age, the man who had slain the Minotaur and united Attica, now seemed to bring disaster and sorrow wherever he went. His wife had committed suicide. His son had died because of a curse Theseus himself had called down. And he had been absent from Athens for long periods, leaving the city to be governed by others while he pursued his own adventures and friendships. The political situation in Athens had deteriorated significantly during Theseus's absence in the underworld. Mnestheus, that descendant of Erechtheus whom the Dioscuri had installed as king when they invaded to rescue Helen, had proven to be an effective administrator and a popular leader. He had been careful to cultivate relationships with the noble families of Athens, listening to their concerns and involving them in governance in a way that Theseus, always somewhat autocratic despite his democratic reforms, had often neglected to do. When Theseus finally returned from the underworld and tried to reclaim his throne, he found that the situation had changed fundamentally. The people of Athens were no longer willing to accept him as their unquestioned ruler. There had been too many disasters, too many absences, too many examples of poor judgment. The Palantidae, or those of them who had survived Theseus's earlier purge, renewed their claims to the throne. Mnestheus had no intention of stepping aside for a king who seemed past his prime and surrounded by tragedy. Theseus tried to assert his authority, but he no longer had the support he once commanded. Fights broke out between his supporters and those who wanted to see him removed from power. The city that Theseus had united and ruled for so long was now divided against itself, and much of that division centered on whether Theseus should remain as king. The final blow came when Mnestheus organized what amounted to a coup, rallying enough support among the nobility and the common people to make Theseus's position untenable. There was no single dramatic confrontation, no battle where Theseus was defeated. Instead, there was a gradual erosion of his support, a growing consensus that Athens needed different leadership, that Theseus's time as king had passed. Faced with this reality, Theseus made a decision that showed both his pride and perhaps his understanding that forcing the issue would only lead to civil war. He cursed the Athenians, calling down the wrath of the gods upon them for their ingratitude and their failure to honor the man who had done so much for their city. Then he gathered his remaining loyal followers and his sons Demophon and Acamas, whom Phaedra had borne him, and left Athens. He sent his sons to the island of Euboea for safety, and he himself sailed to the small island of Syros, that rocky place in the northern Aegean. Syros was ruled by King Lycomedes, and Theseus may have had connections there, perhaps through past friendships or family ties. Some sources say that Theseus owned land on Syros and had intended to retire there peacefully. Others suggest he hoped to use Syros as a base from which to eventually launch an attempt to retake Athens. Lycomedes received Theseus with appropriate hospitality, or at least appeared to do so. But the king of Syros was a practical man, and he understood the political situation. Mnestheus now ruled Athens, and Athens was powerful and wealthy. Theseus, by contrast, was an exiled former king with no real power base, no army, no resources beyond what he had brought with him. And more important, Theseus was potentially dangerous to Lycomedes himself. The people of Syros were said to respect Theseus greatly, honoring him because of his legendary deeds. What if Theseus decided he wanted to be king of Syros? What if he used his reputation to challenge Lycomedes' own authority? Some sources claim that Lycomedes also wanted to curry favor with Menestheus, who now ruled Athens and who would certainly prefer to have Theseus permanently out of the way, whether out of fear or political calculation or both. Lycomedes decided that Theseus had to die. One day, Lycomedes invited Theseus to walk with him in the high places of Scyros, ostensibly to show the exiled king the extent of the lands he had owned on the island. They climbed to the cliffs that overlooked the sea, high rocky crags from which one could see for miles across the Aegean. And there, whether through a sudden push or by somehow engineering an accident, Lycomedes sent Theseus tumbling off the cliff to fall onto the rocks below. The hero who had survived so many dangers, who had defeated bandits and monsters, who had descended into the underworld itself and returned, died from a simple fall off a cliff, killed by a relatively minor king on an insignificant island. It was an ignoble end for one of Greece's greatest heroes, and it seemed to encapsulate the tragedy of Theseus's later life, how far he had fallen from the heights of his glory. Some versions of the story try to soften this ignominious death by suggesting that Theseus had simply slipped and fallen accidentally, that there was no murder involved. But this seems like a later attempt to remove the stain of assassination from the story, to make Theseus's death a tragic accident rather than a deliberate crime. Most ancient sources accept that Lycomedes killed Theseus, whether by his own hand or by ordering his guards to do it. The body of Theseus was buried on Scyros, and for many years, that was where his remains stayed. Back in Athens, life continued without him. Menestheus ruled until he left to join the Greek expedition against Troy, where he would die during the war. After his death, Theseus's sons Demophon and Acamas were able to return to Athens and reclaim their father's throne, proving that the line of Theseus had not been completely erased, despite all the tragedies that had befallen the family. But Theseus himself was not entirely forgotten. In 475 BCE, long after the events of the mythological age, the Athenian general Cimon was campaigning against pirates in the Aegean. During this campaign, he captured the island of Scyros and enslaved its inhabitants. While on the island, Cimon consulted the oracle at Delphi and received a command to recover the bones of Theseus and bring them back to Athens. Cimon took this divine instruction seriously and began searching the island. According to Plutarch, who tells this story, Cimon saw an eagle pecking at a mound of earth, tearing up the ground with its talons. Taking this as a divine sign, he ordered his men to dig at that spot. There they found a coffin of extraordinary size, containing the skeleton of a very tall man. Next to the skeleton lay a bronze spear and a sword, the weapons of a hero from the age of bronze. Cimon had these remains carefully collected and placed aboard his trireme. He sailed back to Athens with great ceremony, and the Athenians received the bones of their legendary king, with processions and sacrifices, celebrating as if Theseus himself had returned to the city. The remains were interred in the heart of Athens, near the gymnasium, and a shrine was built over them. This tomb became an important place in Athenian civic life. It was declared a sanctuary, a place of refuge where runaway slaves and the poor and oppressed could seek protection from those who pursued them. This was fitting, for Theseus had been known in life as a champion of the common people, someone who used his power not just to glorify himself, but to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Athenians established a festival called the Theseus in honor of their legendary king. This celebration was held on the 8th day of the month of Paeanopsian, roughly equivalent to October in the modern calendar, and it included athletic competitions, sacrifices, and civic ceremonies. In fact, the 8th day of every month was considered sacred to Theseus, as it was believed to be the day he first arrived in Athens as a young man. In this way, Theseus achieved in death the honor and recognition that had eluded him in his final years of life. The Athenians, perhaps feeling guilty about how they had treated him, how they had allowed him to be driven into exile, transformed him into an idealized figure, the perfect king and hero whose reign represented a golden age before the troubles and complications of later times. Legacy and conclusion. As we drift towards sleep, let us reflect on the remarkable life of Theseus, that complex hero whose story encompasses such heights of glory and such depths of tragedy. He was not a simple character, not a straightforward hero in the mold of some of his contemporaries. Unlike Heracles, who was defined primarily by his strength and his labors, Theseus represented something more nuanced, more human in both his virtues and his flaws. He was a civilizer, a bringer of order and justice to the wild places. When he cleared the road from Trojan to Athens, when he defeated the bandits who had terrorized travelers for so long, he was performing an act not just of personal courage, but of social benefit. He made the world safer for ordinary people, and that mattered as much as any monster he might have slain. He was a political innovator, the legendary founder of Athenian democracy, the Synoikismos, the unification of Attica under Athens, laid the groundwork for the development of the democratic institutions that would make Athens famous. The principle that all free citizens should have equal rights and equal voices in government, regardless of whether they came from the city or the countryside, from old families or new, was revolutionary for its time and would influence political thought for centuries to come. But he was also reckless and often arrogant, convinced of his own invincibility, and willing to take risks that wiser men would have avoided. His decision to descend into the underworld to help Pirith House steal Persephone was pure hubris, the kind of overreaching that the ancient Greeks believed that would inevitably provoke divine punishment. And indeed, he did pay for that arrogance, losing his best friend and nearly losing his own life in the process. He could be callous in his treatment of women, abandoning Ariadne after she had saved his life, abducting Helen when she was still a child, taking the Amazon queen as his prize, whether she came willingly or by force. The ancient audiences might have seen these as heroic exploits, but they reveal a darker side to Theseus's character, a willingness to treat other people as objects to be won or discarded as circumstances dictated. Yet he was also capable of love and loyalty, of friendship and grief. His bond with Pirith House, however reckless it led him to be, was genuine and deep. His sorrow at the deaths of Phaedra and Hippolytus was real, even if those deaths were partially his own fault. He tried, in his own flawed way, to be a good father, a good husband, a good king. In the end, Theseus was profoundly human, which is perhaps why his story has endured. He represents not the impossible ideal of perfect heroism, but something more realistic and more relatable. He made mistakes, terrible mistakes sometimes, and he paid for those mistakes. But he also achieved great things. and he left Athens transformed, stronger and more unified than he had found it. The question of whether Theseus was a real person or purely mythological remains unanswered and probably unanswerable. Ancient writers believed he was real, a king who had lived during the late Bronze Age, perhaps in the 13th century, BCE, perhaps even later, in the 8th or 9th centuries. Modern scholars are more skeptical, seeing Theseus as a mythological figure onto whom the Athenians projected their own ideals and anxieties about kingship, democracy, heroism, and civilization. But in a sense, it doesn't matter whether Theseus actually existed as a historical figure. The stories told about him, the ideals he represented, the tensions and contradictions embodied in his character, all of these had real effects on how the Athenians understood themselves and their city. Theseus was real in the way that matters most for myth and legend. He was real in the imaginations and beliefs of the people who told his stories, and who looked to him as a model, however flawed, of what a hero and a king should be. His legend influenced art and literature for thousands of years, from the ancient vase paintings that depicted his battle with the Minotaur and the Amazons, to the tragedies of Euripides and Sophocles that explored the darker aspects of his story, to modern retellings in novels, films, and video games. Theseus has remained a figure of fascination. Even the philosophical thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus, which asks whether an object that has had all its components replaced is still the same object, traces its origins back to the legendary ship that carried Theseus to Crete, and that the Athenians preserved for centuries afterward. So, as we close this exploration of Theseus's adventures beyond the labyrinth, as we drift into sleep with these ancient stories echoing in our minds, perhaps we can appreciate the full complexity of this hero. He was not perfect, far from it, but he was brave and clever, strong and innovative, loyal and passionate. He cleared roads of their dangers and united scattered communities into a single polis. He faced down monsters and descended into the underworld itself. He loved and lost, triumphed and fell, built and destroyed. He was, in other words, deeply and recognizably human, and that humanity, with all its potential for both greatness and tragedy, is what makes his story worth telling even now, thousands of years after the ancient Greeks first gathered to hear tales of the hero Theseus. If you enjoyed this journey through the myths of ancient Greece, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the Mythos Deep Dive for more explorations of legendary heroes, gods, and monsters. Your support helps us continue bringing these timeless stories to life in new and engaging ways. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with ancient wonders.